You're listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and education institute making law work for people, places, and the planet. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support our work, consider donating at eli.org/donate.
Welcome back to People, Places, Planet. I'm your host, Sarah Backer. This week's episode is part of our mini-series on plant-based proteins, in which we explore the benefits of plant-based proteins and what municipalities are doing to reduce the carbon footprint from the food we eat. So, what is a plant-based protein? A plant-based protein is any protein that comes from a plant source, such as beans, peas, nuts, nut butters, seeds, and soy products. And when we talk about plant-based proteins, we are talking about whole food plant proteins, so think beans, legumes, and tofu, as well as meat analogs, so plant-based burgers like Impossible or Beyond. So why are we talking about these plant-based proteins? One of the primary reasons is that plant-based proteins have significant potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with food, because they have a comparatively low carbon footprint per gram of protein. And this matters because in the US, on average, over a quarter of a household's carbon footprint comes from the food that they eat. So adding or increasing plant-based protein foods can provide a healthy way to meet protein requirements while reducing the climate and environmental impact of food. I'm joined today by my colleague, Linda Bregan, who is a senior attorney at ELI and the director of our Center for State and Local Governance. Welcome to the podcast, Linda. Before we dive into the substance, I'm hoping, Linda, that you can frame this up for our listeners. So how do plant-based proteins fit more generally into the work that ELI does as part of the Center for State and Local Governance?
Well, thanks, Sarah. I'm really excited to co-host this podcast series with you. And I just want to provide a little context for our listeners about ELI's work in this area. So several years ago, we recognized that municipalities, and let me just clarify, when we use municipalities, it's as a shorthand really for all types of local government. So it could be cities, counties, or towns. But anyway, we recognized a while ago that local governments were filling a gap left at the federal level, and they were stepping up to address climate change in the face of federal inaction in terms of regulating emissions of greenhouse gases. And then at the same time, we got this huge amount of subsidies that were going to local governments to address climate change. So in many cases, what cities or municipalities start with is a pledge to develop a climate action plan. At ELI, we started to focus on how we could support local governments, and particularly small and mid-sized cities that are often understaffed and under-resourced. So over the last few years, we've developed a suite of tools to build the capacity of local governments to take action on climate change. And that includes model ordinances, model policies, and model executive orders, as well as what we call toolkits. All of these tools are aimed at helping localities to lower their carbon footprints, but also to respond to the negative effects of climate change, such as extreme heat and weather events, which we already know that cities are experiencing. They're really on the front lines.
Thanks, Linda. That is very helpful background. Now, can you tell us more about ELI's work on plant-based proteins?
This podcast series came out of our work on a toolkit for incorporating plant-based protein measures and climate action plans. And the toolkit provides municipalities with over 40 examples of plant-based protein actions that they can include in their climate action plans. We specifically focus on measures that a municipality can take to, one, increase the availability of plant-based proteins, and two, to engage the public on their benefits. So let me provide a couple of examples. Actions a municipality could take to increase the availability of plant-based proteins can include increasing municipal procurement of plant-based proteins, for example, or recognizing restaurants that expand their plant-based protein offerings to community members. Actions a municipality could take to engage the public on the benefits of plant-based proteins could include, for example, launching an awareness campaign or sponsoring cooking demonstrations for households or encouraging urban gardens to grow more plant-based proteins. So the toolkit provides these kinds of examples and actions, and it also includes resources, case studies where available. Over time, we've really found that municipal staff like to have examples from similarly situated cities that have adopted a measure that they're considering. So we hope that providing a menu of options in a toolkit will make it easier. It'll reduce the transaction costs for busy municipal staff who want to move the ball forward, but just don't have the time to do a lot of research.
Thanks, Linda. It makes a lot of sense that cities would be interested in what their peers are doing. Can you explain to our listeners what goes into developing a toolkit like this?
We ended up interviewing a dozen plant-based protein experts, and that included academics and behavioral scientists and advocates and greenhouse gas accountants and chefs and municipal staff to identify the actions that are in the toolkit. I want to emphasize that we make sure to include a range of actions because each municipality is unique. This isn't a one-size-fits-all situation. So in this and upcoming podcast episodes, we're going to do a deep dive with some of the experts we talked to in researching the toolkit and explore the range of opportunities for municipalities to incorporate plant-based proteins in their climate action plans. And there are a lot of opportunities. They range from incremental to ambitious. And Sarah, I hope it's okay if I note that you were instrumental in developing the toolkit in your role as an ELI research associate. I just want to point out that you are basically an expert as well.
Thanks, Linda. I really enjoyed working on the toolkit, and plant-based proteins offer so many opportunities to address climate change. So what we want to do in this first episode is talk about how municipalities can begin to include plant-based protein measures in their climate action plans. For our listeners who may not know, climate action plans outline the specific actions that a municipality can take to achieve targeted emissions reductions. So they typically conduct a greenhouse gas emissions inventory to establish baseline emissions levels. They set targets for the municipality and for the community, and then they develop a plan containing various actions for achieving those targets. Although some municipalities have included plant-based protein measures in these plans, relatively few plans include food-related emissions estimates or actions. And Angie Fife, the executive director from ICLEI USA, is here to help us understand why that may be. Angie, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Sarah.
Can you tell us why plant-based protein actions are not yet a main feature of municipal climate action plans?
It's a great question, Sarah. We know that plant-based protein is an excellent way for individuals and therefore communities to reduce their carbon footprint. So why is it not in municipal plans quite yet, or at least not a main feature? I think there are a couple of things. Number one, when the citywide greenhouse gas protocols were developed way back in the 1990s, this was one of the first initiatives at ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability. We wanted to be able to provide to local governments a standard by which they could measure and manage greenhouse gas emissions at the city, county, or regional level. And in developing those protocols, we were mindful of the fact that many of our greenhouse gas emissions are transboundary. We don't just drive within the city of Denver. We drive from Denver to Aurora to Colorado Springs and back to Denver again. So we needed to come up with some rules for how to attribute greenhouse gas emissions to a city or a county. And so the way that the U.S. Community Protocol for Community Scale Greenhouse Gas Emissions was developed was really around almost drawing a circle, a hard boundary around a city, county, or region, and counting the activities that are taking place within that region with some accommodation for transboundary. But as you can imagine, thinking about the things that we consume, these are things that are produced outside of our city boundary for sure, but often outside of our country. And so how do we account for greenhouse gases related to those types of things or the fuels that are used in those other locations? It got very complicated to be thinking about plant-based protein protein versus meat or dairy that's grown and produced outside of our communities. And so it was just ease, I think, of greenhouse gas accounting to begin with. But certainly cities have taken a broader approach to their greenhouse gas emissions. It's widely recognized that a lot of our emissions are attributable to the things that we consume, including meat, dairy, and other food-related emissions. Why we haven't seen that come up as a main driver of action, I think, is because of the nature of the policies that would have to be put in place in order to address those emissions. We're really talking about lifestyle emissions here. So only about 10% of the US population consider themselves vegan or vegetarian. So we would be asking 90% of the folks in our community to not eat meat on a regular basis. And how would we do that?
Well, thanks, Angie. And that really helps explain why it is complicated. One of our takeaways from the research we did for this toolkit is that while it may be a challenge to influence dietary behavior, as you point out, it isn't necessary for people to go vegan to make a difference. Small shifts can have considerable impact on the carbon footprint of the community. I think Project Drawdown made this point, noting that just small changes really add up. You mentioned that some cities are taking a broader approach to measuring and reporting their emissions that doesn't just focus on emissions within the municipal boundary. And some of them are using what are called consumption-based emissions inventories to do this. Can you tell us more about consumption-based emissions inventories and why they're important?
Yeah, so the difference with a consumption-based emissions inventory, as the name implies, we're really trying to identify the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with consumption on an individual basis, typically, and then that's kind of rolled up into a community level by taking per capita emissions and multiplying that by the number of folks in a community. In developing a consumption-based emissions inventory, we're looking at household size, household income, and then we're looking at spending that goes across a couple of different categories, which would be food at home, so what's consumed at home, housing, the types of utilities and services that you have, furniture and equipment. And so all of that then comes into a category of spending. We then multiply that by some greenhouse gas emissions factors, namely those related to carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gas emissions, and kind of roll that up into a CO2 equivalent number. The data that's available is not particularly granular. The economic spending numbers are generally reported by the federal government as part of a metropolitan statistical area. We actually worked with a town in New York a couple of years back, the town of Phillipstown. They actually conducted a survey of individuals within their community. It was a little bit easier for them to do because it's a smaller community. So over a series of months, they conducted surveys and asked people, what do you eat at home? What do you buy at the market? What do you eat out? How much fruits and vegetables versus grains versus meat and dairy and that sort of thing. And we did find some interesting results. We found that indeed, meat and dairy is quite a large proportion of an individual's overall carbon footprint.
Thanks so much, Angie. We really appreciate your insights. And do you think that consumption-based emissions inventories will become more common?
I think they will, and I think they are becoming more common, or even if a city is not working through the process of creating a consumption-based emissions inventory, they're still adding these types of strategies into their climate action plans. Ann Arbor, Michigan is a good example of this. They've got a very robust climate action plan, and one of their strategies is very specifically to help their community to embrace a plant-rich diet, move to more fruits, vegetables, grains, nuts, etc. And they're really doing that by talking about the health impacts. Moving away from a heavy meat diet in particular really is one of those no regrets policies for an individual, in the sense that it has so many other benefits, right? Your health benefits as well as the environmental benefits.
Well, thanks for sitting down with us, Angie. And before we let you go, by way of wrap up, if a municipality comes to ICLEI for advice, as many do, how would you sum up, let's say, the top 3 reasons why a municipality should consider increasing the availability of plant-based proteins?
Yeah, I would say the health benefits for communities. Eating a plant-based diet leads to better health outcomes, of course, as a municipality. Public health and spending on public health related issues is certainly an area of concern. Secondly, I think our work here has been ongoing to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and address climate change. We've been at this for 3 decades now at ICLEI, and I know there are a number of cities that have been with us since the beginning. We've made a lot of progress in the built environment. On the transportation side, this is another area of emissions management for cities. Again, we've made some progress there. I feel like consumption and in particular, reducing the amount of meat that is consumed is an innovative strategy, new horizon, something that we can look for to make some gains. And finally, here where I am in Colorado, we also have issues of drought and water scarcity. About 80% of the water use is used to grow crops that are specifically food for livestock. And so if we are going to get serious about water scarcity in addition to other climate change impacts, a hard look at our diets is something that we're just going to have to do.
Thanks, Angie. That was a great summary. And as we just learned from Angie, consumption-based emissions inventories are one way that a municipality can more accurately measure the greenhouse gas impact of their food consumption. But these inventories can be a time and resource-intensive endeavor. To make data gathering more manageable, some cities have chosen to estimate emissions from municipal food purchasing only.
Right, Sarah. And Washington, D.C., for instance, has chosen this approach.
Yes, and coincidentally, we are joined today by Alyssa Wooden, who is a climate program analyst at the DC Department of Energy and Environment. And she's going to tell us more about DC's process. Welcome, Alyssa. Can you tell us why DC chose to measure emissions from municipal food procurement?
Globally, the food and agriculture sector is responsible for about a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions, mainly due to land use change and methane emissions from livestock. One strategy for reducing agricultural emissions is to shift our diets towards consuming less GHG-intensive foods, such as red meat, and towards more low-carbon foods, such as fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, and other plant-based proteins. Cities like DC purchase millions of dollars of food each year to provide meals for residents in public schools, correctional facilities, and other institutions. So there's a big opportunity to leverage those dollars to purchase lower carbon foods and reduce food-related emissions as a strategy to mitigate climate change. Also, a lot of these high-emitting foods like red and processed meat are associated with adverse health outcomes like heart disease and diabetes. So these shifts can improve the nutritional quality of meals as well. All of this reasoning led DC to pass legislation establishing the Green Food Purchasing Program, which aims to reduce emissions from the district's food procurement, as well as to improve public health and health equity for district residents.
It is so interesting. And for cities that may want to pursue this approach, can you tell us just a little bit more about the process? How does a city go about measuring emissions?
DC is a signatory of the Cool Food Pledge, which is an initiative of the World Resources Institute. And as a signatory, we commit to achieving the food-related emissions reduction target set by Cool Food and report our food purchasing data to WRI annually. In order to obtain that data, we ask district agencies that procure food to send us invoices from their food vendors that include the quantities of each food item purchased in a given year. And once we've categorized the purchases and calculated the total weight or volume of each type of food purchased, we send that data to WRI, who calculates the associated emissions using emissions factors from a global life cycle meta-analysis.
Thanks, Alyssa. So has DC met any challenges in this process?
I think there have been challenges in sort of corralling that data from all the different agencies that we partner with. Different agencies sort of have different procurement processes and ways that they provide food to residents. So depending on what that looks like, the data might be more difficult or less difficult to obtain and track the amount of food that's being procured. So I think that's one challenge, just tracking down data from each agency and getting it all in the same format that is required by WRI to calculate the emissions.
Thanks, Alyssa. That's really interesting. And frankly, it doesn't surprise me that interdepartmental coordination is one of the challenges. As I know in our work with cities, this can be a challenge no matter what the issue is that you're working on. And certainly procurement processes can be quite complicated. So I'm curious, do you have data yet on whether this approach is helping to decrease emissions from municipal food purchasing?
So since DC began implementing the Green Food Purchasing Program, we've established our baseline food-related emissions using 2021 as our baseline year. And we recently submitted our 2022 food purchasing data to WRI. So we hope to have our 2022 emissions data available very soon. And we've also developed best practices for agencies to reduce their food-related emissions. So looking at our baseline data, we saw that, unsurprisingly, red meat was responsible for the greatest amount of food-related emissions in the district. So we focused these best practices around reducing red and processed meat purchasing. We created guidelines that would limit agencies that provide food to 2 servings per week of red meat, 1 serving per week per meal type of processed red meat, and would require at least 1 plant-based option at every meal. We wrote contract language that agencies can add into their food purchasing contracts so that all vendors that enter into a contract with the district would be required to adhere to these guidelines going forward.
So you mentioned calculating a baseline. How did DC choose that target of 25% emissions reduction from municipal food and beverages by 2030?
So a 25% food-related emissions reduction by 2030 is what is required by the Green Food Purchasing Act, and it's also the target that the signatories of the Cool Food Pledge are required to commit to. And the reasoning behind the 25% target in the DC legislation was that it would enable us to be a signatory of the pledge and partner with WRI to do the emissions calculations. And WRI chose 25% as the target for their Cool Food Pledge because it aligns with the decreases in agriculture sector emissions that will be required for the world to meet the Paris Agreement climate goals and prevent global warming from exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Thanks for that explanation, Alyssa. Has DC taken any other steps to help reduce emissions from food?
DC Public Schools specifically is also a member of the Good Food Purchasing Program, a different initiative run by the Center for Good Food Purchasing, which requires members to align their food procurement with a set of 5 values. So there's environmental sustainability, nutrition, local economies, animal welfare, and valued workforce. In aligning DC Public Schools food purchases with these values, a lot of them are very similar to the green food values in terms of purchasing less red meat, more plant-based foods.
Thanks, Alyssa. That's great to hear. So do you have any additional insights to share for cities who are considering measuring emissions from municipal food?
I would say that being a member of the Cool Food Pledge has been very helpful for DC in implementing this program. There's no cost for cities to sign on, provided they do commit to that 25% by 2030 reduction target. And it allows for cities to work with WRI to calculate their food-related emissions and to access all of their resources and expertise. Also, programs like the Green Food Purchasing Program require working really closely with staff across multiple agencies, and it's really important to start engaging with agency staff as early as possible to get staff buy-in, set expectations, and address any concerns they may have. Finally, having this program enshrined in legislation has been really valuable in explaining to agency staff that implementing this program is legally mandated, and it enables us to point to the specific clauses in the legislation that correspond with what we're asking them to do. So I think if other cities can get legislation passed and get funding and staff time allocated to a program like this, I think that will make things a lot easier.
Thanks for that explanation, Alyssa. It seems that having a law on the books and a pledge program that set targets really helped this move forward. Let me just shift topics for a minute because I'm also curious about how your efforts have been received by the different departments and by the public.
The response has been varied depending on which agency we're talking to. I think when it was first passed, a lot of agencies didn't really know what it was, didn't really know what we would be asking them to do. I think there were a lot of concerns that it would be sort of taking away people's options or putting more restrictions on agencies and on the residents who are receiving these foods. But I think as we talked with agencies and explained what exactly we were asking of them, we developed these guidelines around limiting red and processed meat and explained that all of these guidelines are in compliance with federal nutrition standards and they wouldn't require any additional costs on agencies. In fact, in many instances, reducing red meat purchasing can result in a cost savings. I think that really helped increase buy-in. And certain agencies have been really receptive and really interested in this program. I think because it's going to increase nutrition in a lot of cases and reduce the environmental impact of the food that's being served. I think that's really galvanized a lot of people and helped shore up a lot of support for this program. A lot of the work we do is among government agency staff, adding these guidelines to food purchasing contracts, working with staff who are working on nutrition programs to add more plant-based menu items. I think most of that work has been sort of non-public facing. But in the future, I hope that if we really see the success of this program and we really see those food-related emissions decreasing, we can really start publicizing more of that data to residents.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. This was really helpful in understanding how cities can begin measuring emissions from the food that they purchase. And at ELI, we always like to highlight the good work that is being done, not only by large cities like DC, but also by smaller jurisdictions. So now we're going to talk to another local government, and this one is in the Southeast and is much smaller than DC. So we shift our attention to the town of Carrboro, North Carolina. Carrboro has included a measure in its climate action plan to reduce emissions from diets by 80% by 2030. Today, we welcome Laura Janway to the podcast. Laura is the town of Carrboro's Environmental Sustainability Coordinator. Welcome, Laura. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
First off, I just want to say that the Carrboro Climate Action Plan is incredibly impressive in terms of the extensive plant-based protein goals that are laid out. How did Carrboro choose to set this 80% emissions reduction target for food by 2030?
The town council accepted our climate action plan around 2017, and the original goal in that plan was a 50% reduction in emissions by 2025, and that included dietary emissions reductions. However, in 2019, the town council asked staff and our environmental advisory board, which is made up of a group of residents who are really interested in the environment and climate, to take another look because climate science is always changing. And they said, we really want to make sure that our climate action plan goals are aligned with the latest science. And not only that, but they wanted us to look at some measures of climate-related equity. And so we did a lot of research. We looked into what the IPCC was saying, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And then we found some great research on climate equity by a researcher named Jan Robio Dupont. And he was nice enough to share his research with us. And he has some published papers too. But historically, the US has produced a lot of emissions in relation to some other countries globally. So that was one of the reasons why our goal is pretty ambitious, because one of the measures of equity that our Environmental Advisory Board chose to use was that countries with the most historic emissions should reduce their emissions the most. Some of the research said that if you're taking that equity into account, by 2030, your emissions should be at 20% of what they were in 2010. So that's how we got our goal. The goal is not just for the town's emissions, but also relates to the dietary emissions too. It's a parallel goal.
Well, Laura, it sounds like your process for setting the goals was really thoughtful, both science and equity-based. So what kind of actions to achieve the goals are laid out in the Climate Action Plan?
The council appointed a task force of residents to help write the plan. So there was a lot of community input. They had quite a few community meetings where people gave input on what should the plan include and what types of things can we do to actually reach the goals. And the task force wrote the plan with staff. The first big thing that the plan lays out is that we have to figure out our baseline. Basically, we need to develop a method to capture our dietary emissions because we do greenhouse gas emissions inventories, but until a few years ago, they really only looked at the things that were easiest to measure. And so the idea was that we needed to expand the scope of our inventory to look at where are we with dietary emissions. And that involves looking at the whole life cycle of how food is grown and how it gets to Carborough and how it gets to people's plates. And so moving forward, that's the way that we can measure progress towards the reduction goal, and really in the next 6 years, look at how close are we to meeting that 80% reduction? And if not, how can we get there? And then some of the things it talks about are the town setting an example. And so it calls for the town to be like a leader in helping educate people by reducing or eliminating products with the highest emissions at town functions and town events, and making sure things are prominently labeled, that people know that things are locally produced or things like that. So that making sure that the town is setting the example first, and maybe holding some type of community programming like monthly potlucks or movie nights, or even also doing cooking classes, and get the word out to people about how they can make these changes in the food choices that they make every day. The other part of it talks about working with local food purveyors. And so there's a lot of different places in town where people get food. There's grocery stores and restaurants, and we have a really great farmers market where everything sold at the farmers market has to be sourced from within 50 miles of Carborough. And so how can we work with these local food purveyors to help give out that education, or have these food challenges with climate-friendly food options on menus, or just giving people more and more opportunities to access climate-friendly meals? The other thing that the plan talks about is, now that we've helped to kind of lead the way as a town and work with local food purveyors, how can we really inspire and educate people? And how can we basically understand why people are choosing to eat what they eat, and help them learn that food does have a climate impact, and it's not just about a complete overhaul of your diet, which is very intimidating, but making small choices that really add up and you can make over time.
Thanks for sharing that process, Laura. It is really impressive how you went about developing a plan, and I really also love that point about small changes. As Linda mentioned, our toolkit tries to provide a range of actions that municipalities can take, because we recognize that small changes can add up and are a great starting place for a lot of different cities and towns. So what were the challenges that you were anticipating when you included these actions in your plan?
There are so many reasons why people choose to eat the way they do. There's cultural, there's health reasons, there's financial, there's convenience, there's preference, there's location. And so we don't want the town coming in and telling people that their reasons are not perfectly valid. And so we just want to frame the education in a way that it's about the climate-related impact. And the other challenge is that it really is hard to accurately pinpoint the entire food footprint of the town, because we're not out there asking people to keep track of every single thing they eat. It's about trying to figure out, how do we best get that data, and what do we actually need to have an idea? And then I would say the next challenge might be just related to educating people, especially with the internet and social media. I think there's a lot of really confusing dietary information out there. I think the other thing is that people might be intimidated to cook meals if they're not familiar with the ingredients. And so I think it's trying to make it as less intimidating as possible. And then the last thing, I think the challenge might be related to economics, and how can we help people learn that making these changes, you can do it in a cost-effective way. I think some people are coming from very different places financially. I think it's just keeping in mind that everybody's coming at it from a different place, a different perspective.
That was a really helpful and nuanced assessment of the challenges in advancing plant-based proteins, many of which, not surprisingly, are similar to those that Angie Fife from ICLEI highlighted as well. Has the town made any progress on this front yet? Have any of the actions been implemented? If so, how have they been received?
We have started to implement a lot of the actions in the plan. The first thing that we worked on was the baseline inventory. So in 2019, we worked with a consultant to develop a survey. Overall, it was a climate action related survey. So we asked people about composting, gardening, and commuting, but a big part of it was food choices. We focused mostly on asking people about how often they ate meat and dairy. And we did ask people, do you identify as a vegan or vegetarian? And then using the self-reported food consumption data, we worked with a member of our environmental advisory board to analyze the data. And we did have to make a lot of assumptions about average portion sizes and things like that. But overall, we were able to come up with a really good baseline for food-related emissions in Carrboro. And so what we did is we used some of that data and we put it into outreach materials that we hand out at events. We're working now with an intern to really help make our website have a lot more in-depth information on food choices and create presentations that people can take out into the community. There is a lot of enthusiasm from town residents to really dig into this and get people inspired to make changes. The other big thing that we've been working on lately is creating what we're calling the Carrboro Climate Friendly Cookbook. And the idea for the cookbook is to crowdsource recipes from Carrboro residents. And we have a new advisory board that was created in the past couple of years called the Climate Action Team. And they're really focused on engaging with the community. We've also been working on how can we get local restaurants involved with the Climate Friendly Cookbook. And maybe we can ask all the restaurants to submit recipes to the cookbook and get them involved too in helping to promote it. So that's the big plan right now.
Laura, it's great that you're doing all of this outreach, and I especially love the idea of a townwide cookbook. That's really awesome. So before we close out, do you have any final words of guidance or motivation for other cities and towns? In other words, why is it worth it to pursue plant-based protein actions?
I would say it's definitely worth pursuing because it is a big part of everyone's carbon footprint. I think that sometimes it does seem intimidating because food is very, very personal. Once you start really talking to people about it, you realize that there is a lot of motivation for people to make changes, and people, I think, are more open to it than you might think. And it's just about talking with them and seeing where they're coming from.
Thanks so much, Laura. I agree with your optimistic assessment here. I want to thank Laura and Angie and Alyssa for sharing their experiences and expertise with us today. This wraps up episode 1 of our series on plant-based proteins. Next time, we will be discussing how municipalities are increasing the availability of plant-based proteins to reduce emissions from food. We're going to hear about what's actually happening on the ground now, so please be sure to tune in.
Thanks for listening to People, Places, Planet, the official podcast of the Environmental Law Institute. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of people like you. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, attend one of our events, or support our work financially, head to eli.org.